Hello, and welcome to This Week in the Middle East with me, Francis Matthew, and Eddie O'Sullivan. To start, we'll take a look at the headlines.
In This Week in the Middle East. On the 26th of January, the Geneva-based International Court of Justice told Israel to take action to prevent acts of genocide in its war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. The same day, US President Biden agreed with Qatar's Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani that securing the release of hostages taken by Hamas was the key to securing a longer pause in fighting. Yemen's Houthi rebels stepped up attacks on vessels transiting the Red Sea on the 26th of January. This included a strike that started a fire on a fuel tanker operated on behalf of trading firm Trafigura. And on the 27th of January, Britain, Italy, the Netherlands and Finland became the latest countries to pause funding for the UN Refugee Agency for Palestinians, UNRWA. This followed allegations that some of its staff were involved in the 7th of October Hamas attack on Israel. The United States, Australia and Canada had already paused funding to the aid agency.
And there we have it. And so at this stage, I'd like to bring Eddie in. Eddie, hello.
Hello, Francis.
And you're in Florida, I gather.
I am attending a conference on a completely different topic and taking a little bit of holiday to get away from the cold in Britain.
Excellent. Nice and warm?
Lovely.
Very good, very good. So on your headlines there, we had the rather startling news that there's a possible ceasefire coming up in Gaza. It seems hard to imagine that it might happen.
Well, in the end, these things always come to an end. That's inevitable. All conflicts of any kind eventually come to an end. There may be a temporary pause, there may be a permanent pause, but the ceasefire was always going to be, it was always, some kind of ceasefire was always going to happen. The issue, of course, with the terms of the ceasefire, which seems tragic given the loss of life and the terrible suffering that we're seeing in Gaza, that people should be quibbling about details, often rather abstruse ones, when the important thing is stop the killing of civilians. But that's where we are, and it's the formulation of this, how the ceasefire has been developing, is very telling, because of course the United States is involved, Israel is involved, Qatar is involved as a bridging element, and of course, inevitably, Hamas is involved.
So they're all talking to each other.
Yes, but of course through channels. So the Qataris, which are hosting Hamas in Doha, has ability to talk to them, and then it can go back to the United States, and then the United States can then talk to the Israelis. I think the Qataris are not engaging with the Israelis as far as we can tell, and you heard yesterday that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel was expressing doubts about the motivations of the Qataris.
He said bluntly, I don't trust them at all.
Yes, anyway, the kettle and pot. But the key fact is that the person handling this is not the Secretary of State of the United States, Antony Blinken. It's the veteran State Department Foreign Office official, Mr. Burns, who is very well regarded across the world, a tremendous reputation, and he's handling the direct negotiations. And I think that's an encouraging sign.
And that's Bob Burns of the CIA.
Correct.
And he's working with Abbas Kamal, who's head of Egyptian intelligence.
Exactly. And so the Egyptians are coming in. Inevitably, they have to be involved because of their role as the adjacent Arab neighbor to Gaza. And the ones who are actually executing the blockade of the Rafah crossing, which is really restricting the humanitarian flow of aids and goods into Gaza.
Correct. We always call it an Israeli blockade, but actually it's an Egyptian-Israeli blockade.
Well, I think the Egyptians would object to that description. They're saying that they are implementing an agreement that they have, this intergovernmental agreement they have with Israel, which can be defined as being part of the overall framework of the agreement between Egypt and Israel. So they are doing what they're saying they've been asked to do by the Israelis as a country with which they have a partnership. So the Egyptian argument is say, right, okay, we're the executing agency of the blockade at this point, but the people who are really driving it is actually Israel. And I think that's largely indisputable.
But it puzzles me that after so long, Hamas is ready to talk, because we're only talking of a ceasefire here. We're not talking of an end game. So if it's 45 days, 35 days, as variously discussed, or 60 days, some others have reported from America, the war will start again. Now, you know, is Hamas going to give everybody up? Are they going to get the Palestinians out of the jails, which they've asked for? So there's a complicated deal there, but everybody is clear that that's not the end.
Oh, it's not even the beginning of the end, I'm afraid, Francis. And for people looking for quick solutions here, you've got to get real. In a US presidential year when the White House is absolutely constrained by the pressure for those who are arguing for a very hardline approach to the Palestinians, there's no possibility that America is going to risk, or Biden's going to risk, his position in the elections at the end of this year. But we are seeing the ingredients of the deal, and obviously this will involve elements that Hamas want. And what Hamas seems to be, the deal seems to be, first of all, a ceasefire before the defeat of Hamas. And that is an overarching Israeli objective. We have heard the reason why they're using such forces. They want to destroy Hamas completely.
That's what they've said.
And they want Hamas politically to be destroyed and removed and got out of Gaza. Who comes next, no one knows. Now, clearly, that's not part of the deal here. That's not part of the deal. So so Hamas is whatever is left of it in Gaza, and certainly its political position has been retained, because it's arguing is been engaged as the partner into this deal. So that has not been achieved. The second element of all, Hamas again is talking about releasing the hostages, and this is a really critical thing from the Israeli perspective. More than 136 Israelis, including soldiers, who were captured on the 7th of October and held for more than 100 days. And this is a source of enormous problems in Israel, and certainly around which the Israeli opposition are mobilizing, not so much in favor of the civilian deaths on the stop the killing of civilians, but about getting 130 plus out. And that is another priority, another Hamas, you might argue, achievement in this terrible situation, that they have managed to hold on to the hostages and the Israelis have not been able to free them. So that's another element. In return for the 130 hostages, there is the talk about thousands, potentially thousands, of Palestinian prisoners. These are people that the Palestinians would assert with some reason that they are actually political prisoners, that they are being held in an arbitrary way.
But that is what would put Hamas into a very strong position, because they currently seen as an Islamist terror group, as defined by many, but they are also bidding to be a Palestinian liberation organization. If they're the ones who get the prisoners released, they are one up on Fatah, and they're one up on the Palestinian Authority, which looks increasingly feeble.
The big negative for Hamas is that they would say, well, we wouldn't have had 25,000 dead Gazans if you hadn't done this on the 7th of October. And the calculation was that the Palestinian population in Gaza, and certainly more broadly in the Arab world, would form that view. But it appears that has not happened, is that the people in Gaza, and who knows what their real views are, but it appears that the people in Gaza have not turned against Hamas. So overall, this package, and we'll see it, is obviously going to be a painful process. Whether or not, I don't know, the United States at some point, the State Department or the White House is going to say, we think this is a good deal. Now that's going to expose them inevitably to attacks that they are effectively, in reality, providing support to Hamas. And that is a political issue that Mr. Biden really doesn't want to deal with. So I'm not sure how this is going to be solved domestically, apart from the fact that, people are so concerned in America, where I now am, with domestic political matters, and they're not really thinking. I've spoken to a lot of Americans here about a lot of different issues, from Trump to Biden to the economy and jobs and healthcare and refugees. Nobody is mentioning the Gaza situation. It simply is not a priority for the average American.
Other than those who are dug in, like the Zionist lobby and the others.
Well, and I
But
don't want to get affected into that discussion because you get accused of being a conspiracy theorist. But there is clearly a detachment between the priorities of those professional politicians and lobbyists in Washington and what the average American here in Miami. And Miami's a melting pot, not just because he's got a lot of the Cuban Americans here. The majority of people in Miami come from all over other parts of America. They come from the northeast. And so they bring in with them all the kind of what you would call core, solid American political, social perspectives. The Gaza war is simply not something that they are spending a lot of time worrying about. It doesn't affect them directly. And I don't think, in these circumstances, I think the White House could actually say, well, we're doing something which is about a long way away and we've achieved lots of objectives, but we are still standing by Israel. However, we're also getting the hostages out. And I've got a feeling that a lot of Americans will just say, okay, fair enough, at least it's not on the television any longer.
Well, let's see where they take it. I mean, one way for the Biden to do that is let Netanyahu make an agreement and then just say, I'm supporting them and the others. So he avoids that tar. We touched briefly on Egypt just a few minutes ago. I'd like to take a look at Egypt because it's been an ally since the Arab Spring, since Morsi's democratic election, and then the military coup, which put Field Marshal Sisi in as president. And since then, there's been stability. Egypt has been one of the trio with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates who have operated as sort of, the last nation states left in the chaos of the anarchy, which then have to deal with Daesh. So Egypt has become a very close ally of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but it remains an economic basket case. And so while being a single state and a very effective military, it also is in dead trouble. I've got my own thoughts, but let's hear what you think on where Egypt is economically.
Well, Egypt's an inescapable factor here. It's the most populous Arab state. It's got 110 million people. And although its economy is certainly, you can argue, underperforming, it's still, but in regional terms, compared to most of its neighbors, quite a significant one. It's got control over the Suez Canal. It's got oil and gas resources. And it is still seen to a certain extent, and so the Egyptians see themselves as being the center of the Arab world.
Yes.
So you've got this inescapable logic, and they're the neighbors, aren't they? They are next door to Gaza. They cross the water from the Saudis, and they have also got the fully fledged peace treaty with Israel. So they're inescapable. But this whole process, as we're moving ahead, and people are saying, well, Egypt's got to play a role. This has focused a lot of attention on the dysfunctions in the Egyptian system. I have studied the Egyptian economy for a very long time and spent a lot of time in Egypt looking at the numbers and listening to IMF reports. Egypt, in many respects, has been involved in an economic reform program longer than any other country on the planet, at least 4 decades of attempts to turn Egypt, the sleeping giant of the Arab world.
You're not going back to the pharaohs, at least.
No, I'm not going that far. But Egypt, the sleeping giant of the Arab and Islamic world, if only we could come up with a formula, a set of policies that would transform Egypt into a Middle East equivalent of China. They look at all that Egypt's got with its population, its young population, its location, its resources. They say, why can't we do that? But the wise men of the world economy, the IMF downwards, have singularly failed to come up with a formulation that is going to deliver that result. Now, we can sit here for hours and consider why Egypt has not responded to the various forms of stimulation that have been provided. But I think there are really fundamental long-term structural factors at work in Egypt, which means there's no, I wouldn't even say medium-term fix. But this matter has focused attention on the fact that Egypt, for example, has got inflation which is well over 30%. It's got debts. It depends upon external financial support from the IMF and others to keep the government going, at least, and the finance and the pound reasonably solid. So it's got a lot of weaknesses. And then on top of that, and I suppose the crowning issue is how effective has the rule of Mohammed al-Sisi, former general, now prime minister, and celebrating this year his 10th anniversary, after being overwhelmingly elected by the Egyptian people. A lot of people are wondering, when is this man, or where's this system that he's created going to have what you would call a positive effect, both economically and politically? And the answer seems to be, well, we're going to have to wait for a bit longer. This is not a particularly happy situation for the Egyptian leadership to be in. But for the moment, nobody's thinking any illusion that there are quick fixes in Egypt by changing a leader or changing a policy.
No, but I don't think there's a quick fix, but I think there's one or two obvious errors. And as you say, Field Marshal Sisi, now President Sisi, is running a government which gives huge weight to the military, who are not just an army, they're also a whole world in themselves with their own companies. So as he builds 20 more cities out, because Egypt is concentrated in the valley, 20 more cities out in the desert, as he builds his new administrative capital, much along the lines of Brasilia or in Malaysia, all those contracts, well, not all, sorry, I mean, a good hefty 50% going towards the military companies. Another mega project was this this sort of signature. When he took over, he got Gulf support to build this, I think, 70-kilometer long bypass to the Suez Canal. So all these huge projects offer substantial jobs, quite low-level labor opportunities, but they don't offer anything for the private sector to be encouraged about. And he's very wary of liberating any of the sort of there's a huge amount of red tape in Egypt. He's aware of the previous example of Sadat, who had his famous open door policy in the 80s, which was much derided because it brought in foreign companies, it brought in investment, people were building factories, international names of car factories, food factories, agribusiness was coming in, but as was also cronyism and corruption. But at least under Sadat, it was going somewhere, although the inequalities there led to him triggering the Islamism, which we didn't really spot at the time as coming, but he got assassinated.
Yeah, one of the intriguing aspects of modern Egyptian life is actually measurably, empirically testable, how equal Egypt has been, certainly since 62, when the radical economic reforms were brought in by Nasser. It's a very equal society. And that might be one of the reasons why the system can't respond to the kind of policy recommendations that have been made by the IMF and by the West, because the economic policy recommendations made by the IMF, certainly since the early 80s, is about engaging the private sector and stimulating private investment. But the consequences will be inevitably a much, much more unequal society, so that you will have a gap growing between the rich and the poor. And I think there's a dynamic in.
Well, I suspect that there is already a gap between the rich, who are a very small number. But I think what you're talking about is a much larger number of modestly rich.
Yeah, the creation of what Britain and America would recognize as a middle class, a professional middle class, and the difference between them, the gap, would grow income-wise and wealth-wise. Now, there was resistance within Egyptian society to that idea. Now, whether it comes from some kind of embedded ideological commitment to the socialist ideal under Nasser, Arabism of that period, or whether it's due to an Islamic orientation in which all are deemed to be equal in the eyes of God. But there is a resistance to it, and I think it's a factor throughout the Islamic world that attempts to import the Western model with the idea of a very active professional middle class earning 5, 10, 20 times as much as the average person, is something which is difficult for the system to swallow. And I guess what the military does is like it bridges, its role is to kind of bridge between this, the population as a whole, and the vision that has been imported to an extent from the West. And the military, therefore, acts as a sort of stabilizing factor. A very high proportion of the Egyptian population serve in the armed forces. They have pensions associated with it. They're provided with jobs after they've left their service, And this provides a stabilized political stabilizing factor to a country that might, if the full if the full force of Western capitalism is unleashed in a society which in truth is not ready for it.
Well, the problem, the army has a great deal of respect, as was proved in the Tahrir Square calls, and they were very happy to see the army, and the army carried a lot of popular respect. However, someone has to pay for it. And after Camp David, Egypt got American grants second only to Israel. And now it's being carried by the Gulf and the IMF. And but this is not sustainable. So it depends how many billions can pour, and can pour in. So, for example, when Sisi did his bypass canal, he predicted, I think it was about 11, 12 billion dollars, and it turned out to be $6. It's just not happening. So I think as long as Egypt can play off its strategic position and be an important ally for the Gulf billions, it has a way of attracting outside money just to see it through. But I think the answer eventually has to be to create a more vigorous economy, and that's where a middle class will emerge. I mean, the middle class you're describing has to emerge because a lot of them are paid by government salaries, teachers, a lot are on kind of government payroll and grossly underpaid. When I was living there, people were respectable sort of professional jobs, were earning tiny sums of money and eking their life out, mainly surviving because they're on rent control flats.
Exactly, and that was the manifestation of the Nasserite commitment to equality. So the educated English-speaking people that we spent our time with were earning far less than their equivalently qualified people in America or France or Britain. By our standards, it was pitiful. Nevertheless, if you look at the average, the average Egyptian, 50% of the Egyptian people depend on agriculture. 30% are directly employed in farming. You go out of the great sprawl of Cairo into the Nile Valley, and you will see scenes which, it's a cliche, which were reminiscent of something from the Bible, from the Old Testament. And that's where the heart and soul, Francis, that's where the heart and soul of Egypt resides, in the millions. But let's look at the positive side. That certainly, since the early 60s, the life expectancy in Egypt for the average Egyptian has almost doubled. It's now over 70. There have been strides in education and health. And so the country is making progress, recognizable progress, but not at the speed that China has demonstrated or at the speed that the IMF and the other theoreticians would like. It is making progress. And I think the what keeps Sisi and the military in control, and you have to remember that the military have effectively controlled Egypt its whole history. It's always been a former police state, whether it's under the Pharaohs or the Byzantines or the Arabs. It's always been a top-down police state. That the inheritors of this tradition, the armed forces, are slowly, in their view, gradually introducing, improving life for everybody. And slowly, but in a way that's going to be, nobody's going to get any plaudits for this. Nobody's going to stand and say, well done.
Well, I think we have to, we leave your endearingly optimistic view of what's going on. And let's take a look at that other top-down former leader of the Arab world, also a riverine nation in Iraq. Iraq, one of the great powers of Arab world, and now hardly visible in the councils of the great. It's a country which has been split after the chaos following the invasion, and I don't see it coming back together to any great extent. You've got an obvious formal area in the Kurdish regional government, but which was independent almost at one stage. But the rest of it is also split into a sectarian division along the lines of Lebanon. And it's a sad thing to see this great country stumbling through chaos.
Yes, well, you actually identified that 2003 was really a turning point. Iraq was created, obviously, after the collapse of the Ottomans, the defeat of the Ottomans after the First World War, and the British, in their attempts to control this area, huge area, first of all, put together this diverse group of sects of territories with different ethnicities, religions, and divisions, and they put it together under a Sunni monarchy, and the Sunnis being always been a minority, not a small minority in what is Iraq today. And they put a Sunni monarchy that was provided a degree of stability even during the Second World War. But in 58, with the revolution, the deposition of the monarchy, then you had a Ba'athist vision. Now, the Ba'athist vision was firmly Arabist, that Iraq is an Arab nation, indivisible under God. But that formulation, which was enforced by an authoritarian top-down system, enforced by repression in all areas, was deliberately destroyed in 2003 by the United States-UK coalition. And their vision of a future, which was a democratic Iraq. But actually, the truth of the matter is there was a view which was still harbored in parts of Washington, D.C., that Iraq should actually be disintegrated and that northern Iraq, known as the Kurdish areas or the Kurdistan, should become effectively an independent state. Now, that vision has obviously caused into question the viability of the nation state of Iraq as a whole. And it runs into a host of problems in terms of precedents being set. So the destruction of the Iraqi nation state as envisaged by Arab nationalists, by the Ba'ath Party, that was eliminated. What's left is an inherently divided and a vociferous entity. Now, the one way it could go, of course, is that the majority, and it's the actual balance of the demography you can argue about, which is Shiite, could go in towards a state which shares power, obviously, with all the ethnic minorities in Iraq, but would be driven by the Shia majority, mainly living in the south, of course, mainly occupying and holding most of the oil and gas resources of Iraq. But that would be a state that would inevitably orientate towards Iran. So that option is something which is intolerable for the United States and the West. They're doing everything they can to isolate Iran. They do not want to see Iraq moving any closer than it already has to Iran. So we've got this. There's two ways of looking at these things, France. You can say that it's all a problem with the people at the bottom, and if only the Iraqis were more like us, then they would have a better situation. Or you can say, really, the core problem is that outside intervention over decades, now more than a century, well, more than that if you include the Ottomans, has bequeathed a system that is inherently unstable and is bound to underperform. And I suppose until such time as the Iraqi people as a whole can, with as little external interference as possible, define its own future. And that might be the direction we're going towards. Given that,
well, I don't know. The external.
I'll just say this last point. Given that
Yeah.
Baghdad is again demonstrating, that's the government of Baghdad, a desire to get the Americans out of their country, and that the country should choose its own destiny.
Well, there's a few thousand American troops still left there from the coalition fighting Daesh, and they have become the target of Iranian-backed action. So yes, they're now, the government has blown the whistle and said it's time for you guys to go. So the Americans will leave.
The United States continues unilaterally to take military action within the borders of Iraq.
Correct.
American troops can unilaterally, with the approval of Washington, shoot and kill Iraqis if they're deemed to be enemy. Now, this is a really bizarre, it's incomprehensible, I think, from a British or American point of view, that you would have a part of the country where a foreign power is allowed to shoot your own people, however lamentable they may be.
Well, then I think you have to compare that power of those few thousand to shoot those few tens of Iraqis to the power of the Iranian forces, the Quds Force, and also the Sha'abi, the Popular Mobilization Forces, the Shiite militias who are funded and also ordered by Iran. So there you're not talking of a few thousand, you're talking about tens and hundreds of thousands of people in organized structures. Separately, going back to after when the Civil War was kind of dying down, one of the ways they managed to incorporate some of those areas into the structure of nominally there was to incorporate Shiite militias into the Iraqi armed forces. So one could argue that the Iraqi armed forces are a mix of old Saddam, very few left because they're grossly discriminated against. That's why so many of them actually fought with Daesh briefly. You can and old Saddam and Shiite militias. And where do they take their orders from? So when you're talking about lack of external forces, I would include the external Iranian forces in Iraq, which have become deeply embedded in the armed forces and in the economy. So I think the idea of a kind of an Iraqi resurgence emerging is very unlikely. The only possible route at the moment is a kind of subservient role to Iran, which is what thoroughly alarms the Saudis, the neighbors to the south.
Well, I think the Saudi Arabian view may be evolving. They've restored, to a degree, relations with the Iranians after the deep freeze, and they are out talking to each other. The Iranians have demonstrated a tremendous resilience over decades of sanctions, and also have demonstrated their ability to inflict serious harm on people they don't like. Now, this is essentially a leverage point for the Iranians, and you can call them what you like, but comprehensively, they believe they're under siege from the United States. The United States is acting and often declaring as if it wants a regime change in Iran, similar to what they did in Iraq. In those circumstances, it's not surprising that the Iranian regime would try to demonstrate that they're not just going to roll over, and that's what they're doing. So again, it comes back, and I will continue saying this, that you can hold the nations of the region responsible in different ways, but the United States' role in this is not helpful, and that an attempt, and people are calling for this again, for diplomacy to be brought to bear in relations between the United States and Iran. The agreement over nuclear weapons, which was trashed by Trump. So some move to that direction would help everybody, because it would, reduce the tensions and make the Iranians more tractable in what they're doing.
So I just hope that the Saudi, what you mentioned there was important. The Saudi reach out to the Iranians, and that initial discussion brokered by the Chinese, which has been kept warm. Mohammed bin Salman spoke to Raisi after October the 7th and the Gaza war started. So hopefully, even if it's in the deep freeze, it's being kept warm, because I think that would, if it goes somewhere, and what is good about it, it's within the Gulf, it's within the Arab region, it's within the Middle East, and so they're working it out within there without some Kissinger or Blinken coming around to say, oh, we're the Americans, we'll save you all. It's a local, and therefore I think much more lasting deal.
Absolutely. And I think we're very slowly, painfully moving direction that the individual powers in the region are being able to interact with each other in a manner that makes sense to them pragmatically, without having a big brother external factor coming in and saying, you can't do that.
So I think we'll leave it there. We're looking at the local powers coming in, and that gives us plenty to talk about in the following weeks. Eddie, thanks. It's been a very interesting discussion. Great.
Thank you, Francis.